There's been a decline in farm income in Nebraska. What's that mean for producers and the state? That discussion next on Speaking of Nebraska. Welcome to Speaking of Nebraska. I'm Mike Tobias. Each week through early June, we'll be here to talk about important issues. We'll also look at what's happening in state government and share a bit of Nebraska history. After several years of record highs, farm income took a turn in the other direction almost 4 years ago. That downturn continues. We're going to talk to ag economists about this in a couple minutes, but first, what this means for two Nebraska farmers and their operations. This story from NET's Jack Williams as part of our Harvest Public Media Partnership.
This is our little office that we use, kind of a break room. This is the center where we work on the computer or order parts or things like that.
Carl Soshak is right at home on his farm 40 miles north of Lincoln. His family has worked this land since the late 1940s. They grow mostly corn and soybeans, but the last couple of years haven't been easy. Prices have tumbled from record highs just a few years ago to levels today that make it tough for some farmers to turn a profit.
The best thing that ever happened to the corn industry was $7 corn. The worst thing that ever happened to it was $7 corn because it kind of threw everything out of balance. And I think we'll see the cycle come back. I don't know when it's going to come back.
While he waits, Soshak is doing what he can to cut costs on the farm. Instead of taking equipment to the local implement dealer for repairs, he has parts delivered to the farm and does those repairs himself. How much money does that save you doing your own repairs? If you had to take your tractor in yourself, how much would that cost you compared to you actually doing this yourself?
That's a hard number to come up with, but shop rates can run anywhere from $75 to $150 an hour. And service calls, if they come out from the dealership to work on a piece of equipment, a service call could be another $250 on top of that. So if it's something that we can take care of ourselves, every time we do that, we're saving a little bit of money.
Soshak doesn't apologize for enjoying the good times a few years ago. He says farming isn't always easy, and when commodity prices shot up like they did, many farmers enjoyed a higher standard of living. It was a lot different than the days when they had to watch every penny they spent.
But if we need to go back to that, we will. And I think we have already. We're careful about our family living and been there, done that, and we'll do it again if we need to tighten our belt that much. And we are. We're being careful about the way we spend.
Dave Nielsen grows corn and soybeans on about 2,000 acres. His father and grandfather worked this ground before him, so he's seen the good and bad times. He says younger farmers who got into the business a few years ago when prices were high feel the commodity downturn the most.
It was really tough on young guys starting then. Young guys that were starting in those glory years. Wow, this is easy. I mean, there's a lot of youth that came back to the farm, maybe left jobs in town and came back to the family farm to farm. And now it's a whole different ball game. Now it's you really have to watch what you're spending on inputs and family living and that.
Nielsen probably won't lime his soil this year, and like Soshak, he's doing a lot of his own repairs to save money. And he's taking a hard look at the rest of his expenses.
Every good operation should, even in the good times, really, you should. But you probably just a little sharper pen or a little sharper pencil when you're in the downturn.
Well, let's talk more about the ag economy with Brad Lubin, a University of Nebraska-Lincoln ag economist, and Nate Kaufman, an ag economist and Omaha branch executive with the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Thank you both for spending a little time with us today. Nate, going to start with you first because our timing's good. A new report from the Fed today that you authored talks a little bit more and updates the farm income situation and a little bit about what we're seeing. Talk about that.
So the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City has a 7-state region here in the middle of the country, and specifically out of our Omaha office is where we focus on Nebraska. And the survey that we maintain is an attempt to try to gather information about this region, specifically with reference to farm income and what we see happening in credit conditions and farmland values. This morning's report was a reflection of some of the recent data, which as a summary is to say that we've been in this environment the last 3 or 4 years, obviously recognizing a pretty dramatic decline in corn and soybean prices since 2013, 2014, where we're still seeing ongoing pressure. A lot of the bankers that we interact with would suggest that they're continuing to see some shortages in cash flow, recognizing that repayment rates on loans have softened. So that's the environment that we continue to see. That said, a lot of the weakness that we have seen more recently has perhaps been more concentrated in the western part of the state, maybe where there's been a strong exposure to declines in cattle and wheat prices specifically from recent years.
One of the numbers that jumped out at me from that, 73% of bankers reported farm income was lower than the year before. Now, that's a fairly large.
That is substantial, and it's something that would be consistent with what USDA would be reporting recently on a national level. And so specifically regions that have had a strong concentration in some of the major commodities, when we think in this region about corn and soybeans or even cattle, and as you get into wheat and hogs and some of those other areas, many of those prices have fallen dramatically, and it's been an ongoing, a prolonged environment of a downturn in the ag economy.
Yeah. Brad, talk a little bit more about some of the other indicators that tell us where we're at right now.
Well, you know, as Nate described, the continuing decline in farm income certainly is a challenge. For producers, it's as much of a challenge of dealing with the shock of the last 3 to 4 years drop in farm income, drop in commodity prices, as it is the overall level of income and prices. We're dropping to projected farm income levels in Nebraska around $4 billion for the year. That is a drop from $7.5 billion record farm income in 2012 and 2013. So relatively speaking, 50% drops in farm income. But it's also a return to an average that we saw roughly from 2000 to 2008. So it's the shock and the fall off the recent boom in agriculture. Maybe as much so as the overall price levels that are challenging.
So talk a little bit about the drivers. What's causing this to happen?
Well, look at the boom that we did see over the past decade, and the growth in commodity demand, the global supply and demand conditions, and the peak in prices really in the 2012 drought for commodities, the peak in prices in 2013 for livestock at sort of the bottom of the inventory cycle, and you see rebounding production, but you see good production year after good production year, and prices have fallen ever since. Perhaps we're setting, or at least stabilizing a little bit, but we're stabilizing at relatively lower levels that have certainly put financial pressure on producers.
Are there things that aren't captured in some of the numbers that we're talking about?
Well, I think one of the things that we've seen lately, despite some of these concerns, really has been the fact that we haven't seen a lot of outright bankruptcies. We haven't seen a lot of loans going into default. I think part of the reason for that has been that we have seen the market for farmland remain relatively strong. We have seen some declines in that market, despite the declines in corn and soybean prices being very dramatic. The declines in land values have been pretty modest. So I think that's helped hold it up some. And I think what that also points to is that there is a lot of variability from one operation to the next, just depending on what the finances are in one operation, depending on how long a particular farm operation has been involved there. So there are a lot of differences, even though we have seen pressure overall. There's a lot of differences from one operation to the next or one region to the next.
Mm-hmm. You know, we saw that in conjunction with the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, our Ag Economics Department here at UNL did a survey of producers late last summer, and some of those financial questions about what you're adjusting and do you face pressure, do you see concerns for more concerns for the coming year. You know, we come from a position of a very strong financial statement, so the lack of or the relative small number of bankruptcies or forced liquidations maybe doesn't show up yet, but everybody is concerned about and dealing with pressure. And think about who faces pressure first, it's the leveraged operation with borrowed capital. That might be the aggressively growing operation. It might also be the beginning farmer and rancher who starts in and you're in expansion mode. That's how you grow. So the pressure is really felt in some segments of the farm population, even if the overall farm population and farm sector still maintains quite a bit of financial strength.
Other things you're hearing from producers?
I think there's been a lot of concern. I think if you were to have told people prior to this downturn in 2013 that you thought corn prices or soybean prices were going to drop 50%, it would have generated a lot of concern about what the next 4 years might look like. And I think that there certainly have been some producers that have been facing that very much, and they've had to maybe make some difficult decisions and have had to find ways of scaling back or have had some difficult conversations with their lenders. But I think the fact that we are at a point now 4 years into this, though it's been prolonged and it's been difficult in many ways, where things are still kind of moving forward. We're still producing a lot. It seems like we haven't seen a lot of those defaults, a lot of those bankruptcies, which would suggest that though there's been a lot of pain, the question that we often get is how does this compare to the 1980s because of the crisis then, and it just isn't the same place as the 1980s, because by 4 years into that, we would have started to see something considerably worse than where we are right now.
And I do want to talk a little bit more about that, about the cyclical nature of all economies, but especially the ag economy. And Brad Lubin from UNL, I know I've seen you talk about this not being a crisis, but a concern in terms of where we're at in that cycle.
You know, recognize as I suggested, it's dealing with the shock as much as it is the overall absolute level of prices or farm income, and it's the reality after a previous decade from the early 2000s through perhaps 2013, where things just kept getting better. The picture kept getting better year after year after year. It made every decision work. Now we're in a position where even good decisions may not work. It's a substantial change in sort of management focus and recognizing the importance of every nickel, every dime, every penny on cost of production. And for some producers, think the younger generation that started in the last 15 or 20 years, there may not be much experience of making these decisions under different financial conditions. So there's always pressure on the farm segment to adopt. There has been some support. The Farm Income Safety Net of federal farm programs, crop insurance, certainly does provide a buffer, some of which is, particularly on crop insurance, much, much stronger than it was in the 1980s. So there are risk management tools that didn't exist back during the 80s that are useful today. There's also a reality that some farm programs have provided substantial support. We have a revenue safety net or a price safety net. The revenue safety net in Nebraska, which has been very popular and largely enrolled across the state, there has been more than $600 million per year in payments out of that program to help offset the sharp decline in commodity prices and crop revenues. But importantly, that's an average revenue safety net, and that average is falling along with prices. And even that safety net is weaning itself away over the next couple years. It just gives producers time to adopt. It doesn't really insulate them permanently from having to adopt or adapt.
You know, we talk a lot about the interconnection of the ag economy with the overall economy of the state of Nebraska. Nate Kaufman from the Fed, I was interested in something that you wrote a couple of months ago where you were talking about, despite ongoing headwinds in rural parts of the state stemming from this downturn that we're talking about, further increases in employment, strengthening wages, and strong economies in Omaha and Lincoln have underscored a sense of general optimism about the state's economy. So talk about that interconnectiveness, and especially as a state, are we changing in terms of our dependence on agriculture as a driver of the economy?
I think part of that just goes along with some of the changes that have been happening more fundamentally in agriculture over time, which is to say that there are fewer farmers. So in terms of people, there's not as many people involved in operations. And as we've seen demographic shift, we certainly know that there's been more of an increase in the metro parts of the state recently. If you add to that, though, more generally the strength that we see in the national economy being more concentrated in what we would describe as service-based industries, and maybe less so in the traditional, in decades past, the manufacturing-based or the production, specifically at a time when, for example, export markets have maybe been more of a struggle lately with the value of the dollar and other things that have changed since 2014. So we see some of those areas. Omaha and Lincoln very much resemble some of the trends that we see nationally, where a strong service-based economy is doing well. And I think if you add to that the fact that despite some of these challenges in agriculture, as Brad noted, a lot of this has stemmed from several consecutive years of strong production. So in agriculture, the services that are built around that production are still very much needed. In terms of processing that amount of product that comes out of the state of Nebraska, even though it is at lower prices, which creates the pressure in the farm sector.
Mm-hmm. You know, we remember how much or how critical and how important the ag sector is to the state of Nebraska. Research by colleagues of mine here at UNL would update data to tell us that perhaps one of every 4 jobs in the state is ag-related, and that's clearly not all on the farm. That's the input to the production, to the processing, marketing, distribution, even delivery sector. So there's a tremendous breadth in that ag industry, and some of that industry, Nate, as you noted, is volume-based. And so higher volume production at lower prices doesn't fundamentally change that equation. But some of that sector is certainly impacted by the current economic situation. And then that has those multiplier effects, off the farm, on rural main streets, purchasing decisions, family living choices, and so forth that have certainly impacted rural Nebraska and have impacted state forecasts as well.
Yeah, we started touching a little bit about export and trade, and obviously there's, with a change in administration, there's a lot of uncertainty right now in the trade world. What impact is that having on the farm economy right now?
Well, fundamentally, I think we could start and say that in the trade arena, we see concerns in the ag sector about the direction of trade talks and discussions about renegotiating trade agreements, particularly agreements where agriculture has traditionally been a winner of trade in terms of export opportunities, and Nebraska is one of those major producers that benefits from those export opportunities. But not just the direction of the trade discussion, but even the sort of the uncertainty or volatility of how that discussion goes. Which agreements are we going to renegotiate? Which agreements are we going to leave? Which ones change day to day? It really leaves a lot of uncertainty, which may begin to affect a lot of production and management decisions.
I would add to that, just when we look at the state of Nebraska and try to get a sense of what the economic strength might be, specifically as it relates to this topic of exports, I think it's important to recognize that more than 60% of Nebraska's exports ultimately go to 4 countries, and Canada, Mexico, Japan, and China. So anything that would specifically touch on concerns that Brad was pointing to here as it relates to the trade policy front really generates some substantial concern because of the concentration in those significant export partners. So as you have conversations about the slowdown in China or issues around the TPP or NAFTA, those are very much at the forefront of a lot of producers' minds because of the importance of those markets for their products.
Yeah, and at the same time, we're in that window where we're starting to look at a new farm bill.
Right. We're beginning to debate a farm bill that is scheduled for 2018. One version might have us going roughly down the same path we're on, with existing programs, reforms, changes, maybe cuts in spending, but fundamentally the same kind of package we're on. But we've already started with discussion and debate this year and a little fight over cotton programs and dairy programs, where the minutia is pretty detailed, but fundamentally a discussion about trying to reform parts of those programs now. That discussion faltered in the appropriations process here last week, and the Harbinger says if we can't even agree on the little things now, what are we going to agree on next year?
Yeah. So in our last minute or so here, let's try to look forward a little bit and look into the so-called crystal ball. Where are we going in terms of farm income and the farm economy?
I think if you would look at some of the longer-term projections that are out there on both commodity prices and farm income, it would suggest that we're looking at something that's maybe relatively flat given where we are right now. And I think the general consensus on that and sort of support of that thought is that even though demand is still relatively strong, despite some of the concerns around trade or other areas, exports are still actually pretty strong. Biofuels, which was another big driver of the farm boom 10 or 15 years ago, is still at a pretty high level. So the demand side is still pretty strong. But as Brad noted, we've had several consecutive years here of very, very strong production. So we've gotten to a point where the supply that's on the market has been weighing on prices. And it can take some time for some of that supply to start working its way through in an environment where the demand is strong, but the growth is not the same as it had been in previous years. So I think a lot of the expectations of farm income going forward are in recognition that we're just at a phase where supply is going to be high for a while, and it might take some time to get out of that to get prices back up.
Now, one maybe silver lining, it might be tough to look for a silver lining, but one might be that we seem to have stabilized in that regard, at least until we address the next production year and look at production potential. Is that enough? Is a stable price cycle from here going forward enough to let producers continue to manage down on the cost side and improve profitability? We certainly have to focus on those management decisions still going forward.
Okay. Brad Lubin, UNL Ag Economist, thank you.
Thank you.
Nate Kaufman from the Federal Reserve Economist, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, let's take a look at some of the other things NET News is working on. Scientists are using powerful computers, churning through big data to develop better seeds for crops. That story from our partnership with Harvest Public Media, a reporting collaboration focused on food, fuel, and field. Jack Williams followed Nebraska Ponca Indian tribe members who honored ancestors and remembered a forced removal from their land with a 13-day walk. Next week, the court said he was guilty and sent him to prison for 45 years. Janelle Pratt always said he was innocent. Now he's paroled, and Bill Kelly shares his story. You can listen to or read all of our signature stories at netnebraska.org/news and connect with NET News and our journalists on Facebook and Twitter. Requiring Nebraskans to present photo IDs when voting was one issue state lawmakers dealt with this week. Here's some of that debate.
I think if you put this on the ballot, 75% of Nebraskans vote for it. Overwhelmingly, I don't think it's even close. And if the voters of the state of Nebraska support it, I'll be back here with you crafting a voter identification law that does not suppress a single vote. That's my commitment.
This is serious for black people. Black people have died by trying to register to vote. And you white people are going to sit here and play with it? Not with this man.
Well, state government reporter Fred Knapp joins us now. So talk about that proposal, which died in the legislature but may come back in the future.
Right, and it was a proposed constitutional amendment this year, and voters would have had to vote on it next year. After it failed because it didn't get enough votes for cloture, Senator Moranti, the sponsor, said that he's going to try again, either a bill or a constitutional amendment, and if that doesn't work, he'll consider an initiative petition drive to put it on the ballot via a signature campaign.
So he plans on pushing this further for quite a while.
Yeah.
So this was another big budget week. Lawmakers did pass that two-year budget, but the battle between what lawmakers wanted, the majority of lawmakers wanted, and what the governor's office and some other lawmakers wanted isn't over.
Right. The ball is now in the governor's court. He has until Monday at midnight to issue any vetoes. And he's sort of been aided in his case by a revenue report that showed revenues for April coming in below what was projected, although that was an old projection.
Right. But either way, it was still down a little.
Right. And it was down by the same amount that they predicted it would be down over the next 2.5 years. It went down in 1 month.
So talk about the veto process, what the governor can do, what he can't do, what's the timeline, how's this going to play out?
Well, he can make line item reductions. You know, he can say, you gave this agency $10 million, I think they only need $9 million, so I'm going to save $1 million by doing that. Now, if he wants to go whole hog, he can eliminate the $43 million that they got by lowering the budget reserve requirement, but that would require wholesale cuts to who knows what, the university water projects, Medicaid. We'll see.
Do you get a sense of direction, and will some of this happen next week probably?
Yeah, he has until midnight Monday to do his vetoes on the main budget bill, and then the legislature will presumably think it over for a day, and in the middle of next week they'll schedule whatever budget override votes they're going to take.
Okay. So let's talk about a couple other issues that were getting attention this week. One was a proposal to allow felons to vote earlier after they had completed their sentences than they had been able to before.
Right. Right now there's a 2-year waiting period after you complete your sentence or probation before you can vote. Senator Justin Wayne of Omaha proposed to make it effective immediately upon completion of your sentence. You could vote then. He made the argument that historically this has been a measure of discrimination against racial and ethnic minorities. He got 32 votes at one stage of debate, but by the time the governor vetoed it and pressed people to sustain his veto, Wayne was down to 23 votes, and it takes 30 to override, so that failed.
So what was the governor's rationale for vetoing that?
He thinks that it's reasonable to ask people to wait for 2 years and then show that they can keep their record clean. It gives them an incentive to do that, in his view.
Okay. And you may actually get done in the legislature earlier than expected. That was a surprise.
Yeah, the Speaker announced that he was going to make May 23rd the last day. It had been scheduled to be June 2nd, but he said he checked with the governor, and other than the budget, there are no measures pending that the governor is likely to veto, so there's no reason for the legislators to stick around. There's certainly no money to do anything, any new project with, so they're going to plan to get out of town.
And so next week we'll be keeping a quick eye on the budget vetoes.
And that'll be it. There'll be some resolutions to discuss as well.
Okay, Fred, thank you very much. And during the legislative session, you can follow Fred's coverage on NET Radio, on our website at netnebraska.org/news. Beth Streeter Aldrich is one of our state's best-known authors. Her story in our Nebraska 150 moment.
Born in Cedar Falls, Iowa in 1881, Beth Streeter married Charles Sweetser Aldrich in 1907. 2 years later, they moved to Elmwood, Nebraska. In 1911, she wrote a story for a contest in Ladies' Home Journal. She was a finalist from about 2,000 entries and never looked back. Her first book, a compilation of short stories, was published in 1924. Shortly before her first novel was published in 1925, her husband died, leaving Beth a widow with 4 children ranging in age from 4 to 16. Her writing then became a means to support her family and get all her children through college. By the time of her death at age 73, Beth Streeter Aldrich wrote nearly 200 works total. One piece of work became a movie, another a television show.
Well, that's all for this edition of Speaking of Nebraska. Next week, we'll talk about the fight against human trafficking. Thanks for joining us. Good night.